Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Letter 71, Seneca tells his correspondent, and by extension, those of us who are reading him, that one of the key things we need to do is to focus upon what the supreme or highest good, the supremum bonum, is for us human beings. And it's going to be the same for all of us, although we don't all necessarily realize that. As a matter of fact, most of us don't have a clear sight, according to Seneca, of what the supreme good is. And that's a real problem. And he tells us why. If we don't understand what the supreme good is, then we're going to have some problems. He says, how is advice to be found? Advice about specific things. Let me explain. Each time you want to know what to pursue or what to avoid, so that's a fundamental set of concerns for ethics, right? Look to your highest good, the aim of your life as a whole. Everything we do ought to be in accordance with that aim. And you might say, oh, that's perfect. I'm doing values clarification here. I want to make a ton of money and be able to retire by 35. Or I want to pursue as many pleasures as possible. Or I want to rack up all of these successes that will make me feel like the big person that I didn't get from my teachers or parents, that validation. And Seneca would say, well, no, those are not the supreme good. You're actually off target there. And target is a good metaphor. You know, if we are aiming at the wrong thing, we're going to be making the wrong decisions. So he says, only a person who has the entirety of their life in view is in a position to arrange life's particulars. Even with paints all at the ready, no one can render a likeness until he's decided what he wants to paint. You need to have some sort of plan. So he says, everyone deliberates over parts of life, no one over life as a whole. And this is another one where we can think of lots of examples. Somebody who thinks it's really all about making a ton of money, they focus totally on that, and then their relationships go to crap, right? Or their character, or their health, or all sorts of other things. And some people are obsessive about health, and their relationships go to crap because of it. Or other people focus totally on their career, and then they don't focus on these other things. So Seneca says, if you want to shoot an arrow, you must know what you are trying to hit. Only then can you direct the point and steady the shaft. Our counsels are all astray in that they have no mark to aim at. So what should we aim at? Well, what the supreme good is. And he tells us, if we want to understand it, at least this is what the Stoics teach, we have to grasp that the highest good is, as he says, what is honorable. The highest good simply is what is honorable. Quod honestum est. And honestum is a Latin phrase that is a bit difficult to translate. We actually get the word honesty from it, but in the sense of integrity, right? That which has intrinsic value, that which good people recognize as good. And it translates the Greek agathon and also the Greek kalon, which are also difficult. I mean, agathon is easy, good, but good in what sense? Kalon is a bit more difficult to translate. Honorable is a way of describing it. Honorable doesn't have the gripping power that it had in the past for us present people. That which is intrinsically worthwhile, that which is intrinsically valuable. It can even be translated as the beautiful or the fine. So that is what the highest good is and what we ought to be orienting our life around. And what does that mean for the Stoics? What is honorable? Virtue. virtue and the virtues. Remember, the Stoics acknowledge 4 cardinal virtues, same that Plato, by the way, acknowledged and show up in other virtue ethics, that of wisdom, justice, temperance, and courage, with all of the other virtues that fall under these. That is what the highest good is. And when Seneca decides to try to define virtue, which is a difficult thing to do in any really helpful way, he does so a little bit later on. He says, "What is this virtue? True and unshakable judgment." Now, that doesn't sound like what other virtue ethicists will say. Aristotle would say, well, it's a habit, and it's choice-worthy, and, it's going to bear on actions and passions and certain kinds of goods and all that. Why is Seneca talking about judgment here? Well, because for the Stoics, the virtues are not just in terms of our actions and not just habits. They are cognitive. They have to do with viewpoints on what is good and what is bad and how we ought to behave and how we ought to prioritize. So each of those virtues, wisdom, justice, temperance, courage, involves a true and unshakable judgment. And he says, from this come the impulses of the mind. By this every impression that stimulates impulse is rendered perfectly clear. So he's telling us how the virtues actually function. And this is worth pausing on for just a moment. From this come the impulses of the mind. So impulses is translating the Latin impetum, Greek horme. It can also be translated as not just impulse, but choices is a word that's used in the Greek for horme in the Stoic texts. And because we have these correct judgments, we are naturally led to desire the right things, be averse to the right things, have the right emotional reactions or lack of reactions, engage in the right actions. And then he also adds, every impression that stimulates impulse is rendered perfectly clear. We're constantly flooded, both from the outside and from our own screwed up insides, with all sorts of things that the Stoics call impressions or appearances. In Greek, phantasiae, right? And these impressions are taken in by us, and then if we want to exercise the opportunity to, judge them, we do. Otherwise, we sort of automatically respond to them, and then impulse arises from that, and then that leads to our actions and choices, right? Our decisions, our commitments, for better or for worse. So virtue helps us to manage all of these things properly. He also tells us, and this is just a little bit later, it will be consonant with this judgment to regard all things that are associated with virtue as goods and as equal to each other. So there's 2 different points there. They're all goods. So, a relationship in which we confirm each other in virtue, right? A friendship of that sort would be a good. By, contrast, a relationship in which we are making each other worse or impeding each other in virtue, that would be bad, morally bad. It would be bad because it derives from the virtue that's ultimately the source of good or bad, the supreme good, right? In this case, supreme bad, of course, would be vice. We can also judge people as the ones who have virtues as good. We can judge actions as good. So virtue is what makes things in general good. And then there's this assertion that all things associated with virtue are goods and equal to each other. So this leads us into what the Stoics acknowledged as a paradox, that is something that's a little bit hard to swallow. It's counterintuitive. It makes you say, wait a second, I'm not sure about that. And the Stoics did, in fact, assert what we call the equality of goods, if we want to use Cicero's formulation in the Stoic paradoxes. What this means is that they said virtues, insofar as they actually are virtues, are equal to each other. Doesn't matter what they're being exercised in, what circumstances, what matter, to use the term that Seneca is employing here. They're all the same. on a moral level. They're all up here at the highest level, and everything else is down here, except for vice, which is way, way down at the bottom as something bad. So he gives you a lot of examples, historical examples of people who are virtuous and vicious. And we're not going to go through all of these, but let's look at a few. So this is something that he realizes is counterintuitive. He says, what do you mean? Does it not matter whether Cato, one of the great Stoic philosophers and statesmen, is elected praetor or rejected? Does it make no difference at all whether he's defeated at Pharsalus or defeats his enemy? Is this good that he has in remaining unconquerable when his side is defeated really equal to the good he would have had if he'd won that battle, returned to his homeland, and established peace? So these are some good questions, right? If you know anything about the history of Cato. If you don't, you probably want to check him out. Seneca says, yeah, why not? Virtue while defeating adversity is just the same as it is while holding the line in the midst of prosperity. Virtue cannot be made larger or smaller. It has but the one size, which is just enough, right? The right size for it. And he goes on and gives example after example, but you can see what the point of all of this is. He goes on and says, Cato's honorable life is not a greater good than his honorable death. Virtue does not admit of augmentation or growth. And this is, a very important idea. So it's not, as he says, the material itself, but virtue itself that makes things good or bad. And he actually uses the word for making there, efficit, right? It's what makes the things good things or makes the things bad things. So virtue is going to be the source of goodness. And likewise, you can say, well, how would virtue make something bad? That's a little bit of a puzzler. Well, it would tell you, don't do that thing over there. So we can think about how does courage or any of the parts of courage, like endurance, high-mindedness that you see him talking about in here, actual like facing fear courage, how do these things make anything else bad? Because they provide you with a sort of light or lens by which you can look at abandoning your commitments and say, oh yeah, that in fact would be vicious. That would be bad. That would be the opposite of what I ought to do in this circumstance, what the judgment is telling me to do. So there's the answer to that. There's a lot of, particularly in this translation, a lot of discussion that has to do with the word measure. And this is a little bit of a, optical illusion perhaps created by the translations, but I want to talk about some of these phrases. So he tells us that virtue takes the measure of all things and nothing measures virtue. Now the Latin term there is judicat, coming from judicare, right? Judges is another way of thinking about it. But what happens when you're judging? You're actually in some respect imposing a kind of proportion or measure on things. So virtue tells us how we ought to take things, how we ought to use things, how we ought to deal with things, how we ought to place them in proportion to other things, and nothing else does this with virtue. Now, why does he say that? Well, because there's plenty of other people and plenty of other moral theories that would say that something else measures virtue. Think, for example, of people who say things like, when you're doing business with people, you should be honest because that's going to improve your bottom line. Okay, so if honesty is a virtue, which would fall under justice, right? Fair dealings with people, we could say you should be just in your business dealings because that leads to a good bottom line. The good bottom line is the point there. And if you can have the good bottom line without being just, screw being just. Get rid of it, right? In that case, the good bottom line, which is probably a measure, a number, right, is measuring the importance, the quality, the commitment to virtue. And that's getting things completely mixed up. Virtue could tell you that's getting things mixed up, but you'd have to actually listen to virtue. As a matter of fact, you'd probably have to, as he says a little bit earlier in here, not just love virtue, but have a burning desire for virtue, right? He also tells us that virtue does not increase. Why? Because it has its measure. And he actually also says its measure is full. So what is the measure here? Numeros suos. Interestingly, here's using the word number. Virtue's got its number, as we might say in the phrase, or I say, I've got your number, buddy. Well, virtue has its own measure within itself. And then he also talks about, a little bit later in this section, he says, coming back to the question of the equality of things, what's this? Reclining at dinner is equal to being tortured? And he says, does this surprise you? Here's something that will amaze you even more. Reclining at dinner is bad and lying on the rack is good if the one is done in a disgraceful or vicious manner and the other honorably or virtuous. It is not the material, as we said, that makes them good or bad, but virtue. Wherever virtue appears, everything is, as he says, of the same measure and the same value. And here he is actually using the word that it's a cognate for measure. Eustem, the same, mensurai et pretii, of the same measure, the same proportionality, and value, the same reward is another way of thinking about it. The last thing that we have to talk about that's quite important in this particular letter, where he's telling us about the supreme good, but also telling us an awful lot of useful stuff about how the Stoics understood virtue, is that we need to understand that we are not the exemplar, the sage, and treat ourselves accordingly. So he says that the wise person vanquishes misfortune through courage. Many who profess wisdom but don't actually have wisdom are terrified by the most trivial of threats. At this point, the fault is ours. Why? Demanding the same from one who is making progress as from the sage. Now, the one who's making progress, in Greek, the Stoics called that person a prokopton, and that is translated in Latin by a proficientes, right, is the plural of that. So those who are making progress, who are not yet entirely virtuous, but are on the way to it, they don't have the same capacities as the sage. And Seneca tells you about his own case. I am still persuading myself of the principles I extol. I am not yet fully convinced. And even if I were, I would not have the lessons so well prepared, so well practiced, as to have them to spring to my defense in every tribulation. And here he uses a metaphor that he employs in many other places. Just as some dyes are readily absorbed by the wool, others only after repeated soaking and simmering. So there are studies that show up well in our minds as soon as we've learned them. This one, though, must permeate us thoroughly. It must soak in, giving not just a tinge of color, but a real deep dye, or it cannot deliver on any of its promises. And a little bit earlier, he talks about, the sage as also being human. Here we go. He says, I do not put the sage in a separate class from the rest of humankind. Neither do I eliminate pain and grief from him as if he were some sort of rock, not susceptible to any feeling. I keep in mind that he's made of two parts. One is non-rational. That's what experiences the biting, the burning, the pain. The other part is rational. It is this that holds unshakable opinions, and that is fearless and unconquerable. In this latter resides the highest good of humankind. Before that good is filled out, the mind is uncertain and in turmoil, but when it has been perfected, the mind is stable and unmoved. And so he talks about the person who's made a start, the one who's committed to virtue but still ascending, will sometimes slack off and allow their concentration to falter. So we've got the sage on the one hand, who's still human, but has managed to, become virtuous in a full sense. And then we have the person who recognizes that virtue is the highest good, and they're working at it. Now, a good question is virtue increasing in them? And Seneca would say, virtue's not increasing. That person's capacity to grasp, to understand, to make use of virtue, that's what's increasing. So the virtue itself remains the same. The virtue is the highest good that that person in some sense is drawing upon. So this is a very important letter because it tells us an awful lot about how Seneca and his Stoic school understand virtue, not just as the highest good, but as that which makes other things good, or by extension, in opposition, bad.